Welcome everyone to our first Wild Christian online event. My name is Hannah Eves. I work for A Rocha UK and I'm going to be facilitating today's webinar. Big thank you to all of you for joining us for this 45-minute COP and Climate Sunday briefing. We are absolutely delighted to have so many of you with us. For those who are hearing about A Rocha UK for the first time, we are a Christian conservation charity and our mission is to equip Christians and churches in the UK to care for the environment. This is mainly done through our eco-church programme, also for our conservation and our convening work and our Wild Christian community. Wild Christian is a programme that we're running for individuals and families exploring the connections between Christian faith, the natural environment and how we live. If you aren't already, we'd absolutely love for you to be part of our Wild Christian community, and we will give you the chance to know more and sign up in an email you will receive after the seminar. Now, our briefing today takes place on what should have been the end of the first week of the UN Climate Change Conference, or COP26, now taking place in Glasgow in November 2021. Before the speakers tell us more about COP Conference and Climate Sunday, we just wanted to say a huge thank you to all of them, to Andy Atkins, Hannah Brown, and James Anthony. So we're going to start by hearing more about the UN Climate Change Conference from our first speaker, Andy Atkins, who's the CEO of A Rocha UK. Andy, if you could please request unmute now, we'll make sure everyone can hear you and then kick
off. I think I've unmuted. Can you hear me? Perfect. Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. Good to see you too. Climate COPs are notoriously complex negotiations, and their outcomes routinely fall short of what is required by science and justice. I think many of us on this call are probably aware of that. So they get a bad press. Personally, I've participated in a number of COPs, and while they've given me some of my most fulfilling experiences in my work life, they've also given me some of my most depressing and distressing. Nevertheless, I believe they are critical. They are the only forum where all countries can regularly talk together and reach agreement on collective action on this global problem. So let me set the context for the seminar by briefly unpacking what they are and how they work, and what is key about the forthcoming COP26. So what is a COP, first of all? Some of you will know this, but COP is an acronym for Conference of Parties to any UN convention, in fact. There are dozens of UN conventions and all have regular COPs. But in this case, in the case of the climate COP, it is the decision-making body for the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, or UNFCCC in the jargon. Now, currently there are 197 parties. Those are 196 countries and one economic bloc, the EU, that are parties to the convention. So the parties are national governments by and large, but others can attend. Only governments get a vote, however. That's really important to understand. So next year, the UK will host what is formally the 26th Annual Conference of Parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. You can understand why everybody just calls it COP26 for short. So how do COPs actually work? Well, official delegations from each signatory country fly in for 2 weeks and convene with their opposite numbers from other countries for simultaneous negotiations on dozens of different but related topics. They're very complex. These discussions are usually headed by, forgive me, these discussions are usually headed by civil servants in the first week, but in the second week, the politicians, including some heads of state, fly in for the so-called high-level segment, signing off on any agreements and so on. Now, there are two features I'd highlight as relevant to our role as churches and Christians. The first one is about fairness of the negotiations. And although it's technically one country, one vote, in reality, there's a huge disparity in negotiating power between countries, because the richer ones can afford to send large delegations, giving them a huge advantage in information and in voice. It's not unusual, for example, and I've seen this in many COPs I've been to, that the US or the EU delegation on its own is bigger than all the African delegations put together. Secondly, then, on the role of civil society, while these are so-called intergovernmental negotiations, the UN recognizes that civil society can bring much to them. So there's a major civil society participation as well, with development and environment charities, universities, indigenous peoples organizations, faith groups, sending representatives to try to inform and influence government delegations, as well as to build their own alliances and exchange learning between themselves. So although progress in the international negotiations has been much slower than science and justice demands, civil society has played a major role in obtaining the progress there has been, particularly batting for building the capacity of the developing country delegations. Now, what's COP26 trying to achieve in particular? Back in March of this year, the UN General Secretary said, if we are going to limit global heating to 1.5 degrees Celsius, we need to demonstrate, starting this year, how we will achieve emission reductions of 45% from 2010 levels this decade, and how we will reach net zero emissions by mid-century. And he set out 4 objectives for COP26. First is that national climate plans should show that countries are working to implement the Paris Agreement, that is, trying to keep to no more than 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial global temperature levels. Secondly, that all nations should adopt strategies to reach net zero emissions by 2050. Thirdly, that there should be a whole raft of initiatives to help countries adapt to the climate change we're already experiencing and which will get worse. And fourthly, the provision of finance, with developed countries delivering on their previous promises to mobilize $10 billion a year of climate finance by 2020, a promise that is unfulfilled at present. Now, the UK government has already identified 5 big themes that it wants to prioritise to help deliver those outcomes. And one of them, very interestingly for us, is nature. Now, it makes sense and it's good news, but it also has risks. It's good news because we obviously need to address both the climate and the biodiversity emergencies. Moreover, they affect each other and have common drivers. For example, a major cause of the loss of biodiversity is the clearing of national habitat for agriculture, particularly forests and wetlands. But that's also a major source of carbon emissions. So there are massive win-wins to be had from addressing climate and biodiversity loss together. Believe it or not, the window cleaner has just come to my mother-in-law's house. I have no control over this. Bear with this if you can hear noise off to my left. However, and here I will round up, there are potential risks too, including the idea that simply by planting more trees, we can dig ourselves out of this massive hole and avoid other more challenging actions. We can't. Unfortunately, because of decades of foot dragging, we now urgently need to deploy a whole range of measures at scale, from rapidly getting off fossil fuel and onto renewable energy, through energy efficiency and a circular economy to cut waste, to national scale and industrial carbon capture and storage with all its risks, as well as deploying nature-based solutions. There is no one single bullet, and we cannot rely on just nature to solve this problem for us, although we must look for the win-wins. Now, as Christians who care about all of God's creation, nature and humans, we believe we have an important role to play as a community in advocating for those win-wins, in demonstrating them where we can in our churches and our homes and our communities, and in helping work through some of those trade-offs, some of those difficult issues between climate and biodiversity where they arise. Now, I hope this sets the scene for James and Hannah and what they're going to explain about what churches in particular have done over the years, and also what we are lining up to do together for this COP26. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. I only hope that that window cleaner has learned a little bit about COP26 as well. And now for our next speaker, Hannah Brown, will be sharing a bit more about the relationship between the church and COP. Hannah is the Campaigns and Church Engagement Officer for the Joint Public Issues Team, which is often known as JPIT for short. And in case you don't know, JPIT is a Baptist Union, United Reformed Church, Church of Scotland and Methodist Church working together on issues of peace and justice. Hannah, please unmute your mic, and now over to you.
Thanks, Hannah. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about how churches and faith groups have engaged with COP in the past, and what we might learn from that for how we engage this year, but also what some of the differences might be to this year's COP. So I'm not going to go all the way back. We're on COP26 now, so that might take us back quite a little way. But where I will take us back to start off with, if I just share my screen, is COP15 in 2009 in Copenhagen. Now, this might be quite a familiar sight to some of you who might have even been at some of these marches and rallies that I'm going to show some pictures of. But COP15 in Copenhagen saw one of the biggest, if not the biggest, climate event happen in London, the Wave. So that was tens of thousands of people from across civil society turning out to be a loud voice, a loud call to say action and commitment really needed to happen at this COP. And whilst that was a wide civil society event, a number of faith voices are present, and you might be able to kind of spot the placard on these pictures to see where you can see some of the signs from some of the major Christian NGOs at that space. So even though COP15 in Copenhagen was seen as quite a failure for a number of reasons, I think one of the positive things that we can take out of it was this loud civil society voice, the start of a movement to say that faith and civil society were deeply engaged with the outcomes of the COP. So I'm going to skip us forward now to Paris, 2015 at COP21, which perhaps is seen as a more successful COP, again for a number of reasons. And perhaps our journey of faith voices here starts with the people in the top right-hand corner, some of whom I think are actually on the call as well. So you'll have to see if you can spot any familiar faces with our pilgrims to Paris, which are about 44 people who walked from London to the COP in Paris. Intergenerational, ecumenical group of Christians who decided to take action along with hundreds of others from around the world actually who took part in pilgrimages, faith pilgrimages from their countries to the COP, who culminated in the weekend before the COP in a global climate march, which was an action to show world leaders and delegates in Paris that civil society and faith voices were rising up to say, we need outcomes. This is an important moment for us as citizens of the world, but an important moment for you as leaders too. And perhaps one of the most profound things that happened at that COP with the inclusion of faith voices was on the Saturday before the COP began, which was an event with Christiana Figueres, who chaired the UN climate talks, where petitions signed by faith groups from around the world, which amounted to over 1.8 million signatures, were presented to the chair of the talks by the Archbishop of Cape Town. If I just skip forward, this brilliant picture from that talk of Christiana Figueres dancing with the Archbishop of Cape Town at that presentation. And she's spoken quite recently actually about the impact that that moment had on the talks, on her personally as leader of those talks, but on the wider delegation as well, which was a moment of momentum, of movement building for those talks for a number of reasons, but actually is noted as a particular moment of deepening of those talks that will have prompted the positive outcomes that came out there. So I think these are kind of a very brief overview of things that have happened at the COP in the past in an external sense. So it's important to recognise that whilst there's kind of this action that goes on the fringes of the COP, faith delegations are present in the COP itself. Like Andy said, they don't get necessarily a voting voice unless they're kind of made up as part of the government delegations. But they are an influencing voice, and actually this wider engagement outside of the COP is a way of adding legitimacy and strength to those voices who are present in the room as well. So what can we learn from the things that have happened in the past of these particular highlights but other faith voices at the COP? So I think to start with, we can say that there's evidence that churches and faith voices being involved with the COP does make a difference. From a number of people I've been speaking to this week about their involvement with the COP, one of the repeated factors was this connection of head and heart, that actually the presence of faith and particularly Christian voices at the COP helps us to bring that moral dimension to climate talks that can often get stuck on the practical, that can often get stuck on self-interest. And actually the presence of faith voices in those spaces can help bring that moral dimension, that connection of head and heart. Another thing I think we can learn is that practical action brings integrity to the advocacy faith voices can bring to the COP. So when advocacy comes with commitment, it deepens the impact that voice can have on decision makers, on world leaders. whether that's through pilgrimage, through people taking that physical action of walking and dedicating their time, or in eco-church commitments or national commitments that denominations might make. We can recognise the value of marrying action to voice for doubling the impact of what our advocacy can make. So that joining of witness and advocacy is a really important element of church engagement with the COP. I think another thing we can recognise is that we are part of a bigger picture. From those pictures of the wave and from other pilgrimages, we can see that faith does have a distinctive voice to add, and when we really identify and utilise that distinctive voice, it can be really powerful. But faith voices make up part of the network of wider civil society action at the COP. And churches being embedded in so many local communities can be a really powerful tool for building and mobilising wider action beyond faith voices as well. And I think that's a really important thing to remember. And finally, I think one of the lessons we can learn is that COP, whilst important, isn't necessarily the destination of our action on climate change, but it's a key landmark on the journey. So one of the risks of kind of putting all of our energy for activism around climate into the COP is that you can kind of see it as this be-all and end-all moment for climate action, that if outcomes don't happen at the COP, then we're stuck. And whilst that is true in part, I think we can recognise that the COP is part, again, of that wider fabric and framework of action on the climate that takes all of us. It crucially takes government and international action, but it does take all of us as well. So how can we see the COP this year and in future years as a tool for momentum and action, and that really important landmark, but as a marker on the journey rather than the final destination? And very briefly, before I get told off for probably running over my time, I think there are a few things to highlight about how this COP might be different. It's going to be different in a number of ways for the obvious reasons that it's happening kind of on our turf, it's happening in the UK, but also for the obvious changes that COVID will and has made to the way advocacy is happening in the UK at the moment. So I think it's important to bear those things in mind. And for me, the first thing is make it local. The COP is coming home this year, and that reminds us of the importance of localised action, and that despite talks happening at an international level, we shouldn't lose the value of the local commitments we can make, whether that's by our church, by our wider communities, individually, that bring depth to the engagement that we can make at the COP. And I think as well, recognising in that our government has a really key role this year as convener and president of the talks that will happen, and that civil society engagement at depth from the UK will strengthen that and will hopefully add to the call for their bold and courageous action at these talks. The second thing of it being at home for us is the hospitality element. I was speaking to one of the people who was part of the pilgrimage to Paris in 2015, and they said that one of the most humbling aspects of the pilgrimage for them was the hospitality they received on the journey, whether that was from churches in the UK or in France. And I think we can take seriously this year the importance of creating hospitality that produces a culture where inclusive conversation can happen, where ambitious conversation can happen. We're going to play a huge part in creating that space and that atmosphere for talks to take place. And I think churches can play a really key role in that, differently to perhaps what we've done before. And the last thing is digital. We don't know what the COP will look like. We don't really know what next week looks like at the moment, never mind next November. But it is unlikely that things that have worked in the past are going to work in exactly the same way this year, whether that's because of physical restrictions or because the tools that are effective have changed in our advocacy because of COVID, because of this increasingly digital situation we find ourselves in. So I think we should see that as an opportunity to do things a little bit differently, to do things digitally. Engaging international leaders in conversation is so much easier at the moment because we can kind of connect across barriers online, but also spreading the word in digitally engaged communities is a new opportunity that we might not necessarily have utilised before. So that's kind of a whistle-stop tour of what we've done in the past and how that might impact this year. But I think we can take faith action at past COPs as an exciting and encouraging mandate for action this year, but also as a calling to think creatively about the opportunities we might have for COP26.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Hannah. Just quickly before I introduce our final speaker, don't forget any questions you have for Andy, Hannah and James in the chat box. So finally, last but not least, we have James Anthony, who is the project coordinator of Climate Sunday. James, please unmute your mic and give us a wave.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. So I'm going to share a little bit now about the practical initiative that the church in the UK is collectively running in the year to COP26, and that is Climate Sunday. A coalition of over 20 of the UK's denominations, Christian environmental charities and development charities has come together to take action on climate change. And here are some of the organisations who are formally backing this initiative. And what we are enabling the church to do across the UK is to hold a climate-focused service, making the connection between our faith and action on climate. And here are some examples of local congregations who have held climate-focused services since the 6th of September, which is when the campaign launched. And we have a full year of opportunity for congregations to take part. And over that year, we're hoping that thousands of churches will do just that, either in person or online. We have a website, which you can see at climatesunday.org, and the link to that will be in your inbox after this webinar. But on there, you can see the three approaches that the initiative has. Now, the first is the climate-focused services, and the website has resources that your church can use to help plan their service, and the ability to register that service so we can count it as part of the campaign. Secondly, we're encouraging churches to commit to long-term action, because climate campaigning doesn't stop at COP26, albeit it's an important marker. Now, that climate action, that long-term action churches can take, for many will mean joining one of the existing greening schemes. Now, A Rocha UK run EcoChurch, which is the scheme for England and Wales. And I'd encourage you, if you're not already a part of that scheme, to take a look at your congregation joining. In the other nations, we have Eco Congregation Scotland, Eco Congregation Ireland, and also Live Simply for Catholic parishes in England and Wales. So these schemes allow churches to take sustained long-term action across a number of areas, whether that be in their worship, in looking after their grounds, or in their community action, or even things with buildings, energy efficiency and renewables as a couple of examples. So, as I say, we're encouraging churches to join one of those schemes for their long-term action. And thirdly, the campaign is asking all churches who participate to sign a Climate Coalition's declaration, which is called The Time Is Now. Now, this is the largest declaration in the UK over the coming year on climate action. There are 140 organisations that form the Climate Coalition, A Rocha UK being one of those. And the declaration is directed at our Prime Minister and is calling on him to take bold, ambitious action, both here in the UK, but also in terms of the commitments at COP26, so that we end up with commitments for a cleaner, greener society. And there are around 22 million members of those 140 organisations that form the Climate Coalition. So by adding the church's voice, both the church as an organisation, but also the church as individuals signing this declaration, we're hoping that the sheer number of people signing up to that will really make a difference in this coming year. So those are the headlines of Climate Sunday. What I would ask today is that if your church has not already made a decision to get involved, that you would talk to your church leaders and your green team if you're already a part of one of the greening schemes, and start planning that. Have a look at the website, see how you can get involved, and do get in touch if there's anything that we can do to support you. But now I'll hand back to Hannah, who's going to facilitate a time of questions for questions from yourselves to Hannah, Andy, and myself. Thank you.
Right, thank you so much, James. We've had quite a few questions coming via the chat box, so we're going to launch straight into them. So first, a question for Andy Atkins. Do faith groups of any faith have voting rights at COP26? And if not, is it too late to lobby to get a vote?
If you can hear me, no, they don't have voting rights. It's an intergovernmental forum, so it's only governments that get a vote. And yes, it's almost certainly too late. This is not just about COP26. All intergovernmental forums are, as they say on the tin, they're for governments. However, there are other fora that exist that do bring together different expressions of government, civil society, and so on with, if you like, equal voice. But this isn't one of them. The UN system is largely intergovernmental.
Right, thank you. Hannah Brown. Peter has asked, how can faith groups influence our politicians?
I think there are a number of answers to that, and I probably don't have time to go into them all in 3 minutes. I think we can probably see it at multiple levels, starting at the kind of one-to-one individual level. Your MPs make a difference this year in a much bigger way than they have before. Individual and local relationships with MPs, to talk to them about what you would like the government to do on your behalf at the COP this year is really important. So that engagement can start now and can continue all the way through to next November. There's that kind of next step up of how we as organisations can engage with the government. If you're part of a church denomination that JPIT is part of this for the denominations we represent, but we're involved in kind of advocacy around policy action for the churches, and we're involved with initiatives like Climate Sunday, with other initiatives through people like Faith for the Climate, in lobbying the government on behalf of our members for ambitious action at the COP. And adding your voice to campaigns that encourage that is really important between now and next November. And then I think the stuff that we've talked about already is really important. Those big actions. I know somebody in the chat mentioned kind of pilgrimages are great, but how can we engage with our politicians? They are part of the way that we engage with our politicians. Making that noise, gathering that attention and showing commitment is a really important step to catching attention and getting people to take us seriously, getting decision makers to take us seriously. So I think at each of those levels and in lots of different ways we can be engaging with our politicians. But I would really encourage you, maybe one organisation we can talk about here is Hope for the Future. They're a really great organisation who help churches engage with their MPs on climate issues. And so if you're a church who wants to start doing that, get in touch with them and they will give you one-to-one support to help you do that. I'm sure we can send information about that round.
Thanks, Hannah. For James, how can we best support Climate Sunday, and what are your top tips for hosting a Climate Sunday service?
So in terms of how we can best support it, I think at this stage, spread the word. What we are really keen and being intentional about is not just engaging with churches who've already taken action on climate, but reaching those congregations, of which there are thousands around the country, who've never made that connection yet between our faith and action on climate. So if you have friends or family and congregations that you know are not already a part of EcoChurch or one of the similar schemes, I'd encourage you to have a conversation. Have they heard of Climate Sunday? Send in the link so that they can start to consider how that could fit in their context. We, in terms of top tips, second part of that question, I think we can be creative with how we hold our climate-focused services. And I'd say engage as many people within your congregation as possible, because action on climate goes across everything we do in life, whether it be travel, whether it be how we engage with nature, or the food choices we make, or how we heat our homes. Climate change practically is linked to almost everything we do. So there's been some fantastic examples of churches who have taken action in their church yards with BirdLife, for example, and they've had local school kids involved in that. There's been churches that have really done sort of showcase projects when it comes to renewables and energy efficiency, both in the church building, but also that's really applicable in people's homes as well. So I'd say use the examples locally, reach out to local climate groups. Your local Greenpeace group is a great example where you'll find people who have similar ethos and desires as the church, and it can be a bridge builder. So yeah, I'd say include as many people as possible. And of course, if you can, put it online too. It's been fantastic to go on YouTube and type in Climate Sunday and see examples of services from churches of every tradition across the 4 nations, which any of us can do as well if we're looking for inspiration.
Brilliant, thanks James. A question for the panel. How would you advise individuals and churches to make a difference?
Shall I go first on that? At the moment, in this particular year, I believe that the more we can all gather around one thing that makes the biggest possible noise and has the biggest possible numbers around it, the more likely we are to influence both other churches to get involved and actually to have influence on the government. And that thing is Climate Sunday, which James is coordinating, and many of us are behind. I cannot think of a better thing to do this year than get your church involved in Climate Sunday and making that commitment to keep going. So that's for the long term, and then signing that common call. And the more churches we can show sign that common call, the more we're contributing both to wider civil society efforts, and the more we can say to government, look, tens of thousands of churches are committing to action, and then we are asking you take action too. That's the most powerful signal. Practical action and advocacy via Climate Sunday.
Yeah, I think I'd just add to that whilst in many ways it is a bit of a hindrance, we have been given the gift of time this year, and don't wait until next October. Like, even though the COP is next November, don't wait until next October to say, oh, it's next month, we'll get involved then. Use the time we have to deepen your individual and your church engagement with climate response. Because it will mean that the advocacy we can do next autumn is much richer and stronger. It's a journey. We're all going on a journey with climate action. And I'm sure many of you will identify when we say that lots of churches, it's a slow journey for them, and that actually really embedding this takes time, and it takes prayer and it takes discernment. We have the time to do that between now and next year when the COP takes place, and starting that now will really make a difference.
Yeah, and I just to add to that as well, I think our government are listening to the faith community. That Climate Sunday and coalition partners have had calls with the COP26 unit at government. What they are doing is looking to see what civil society, what faith groups are doing, what are we saying, what is the message, because ultimately government is driven by the demands, I guess, of citizens and of society, and really how important that is right now is probably more crucial than it's ever been. Over the next month or so, the UK will be publishing its nationally determined contribution, which is essentially what the UK is committing to going into COP. And as the host nation for the conference, what we commit to as the UK is particularly important, as other nations will be looking at the host to see the level of ambition and the level of commitment that's being put forward. So I think, as Hannah said, we can't wait until November next year, because in a sense, for our voices to be heard at COP, we have to build that momentum already, and we have to be collectively on the same page. And I think that's why the Climate Coalition's declaration is so important, because it brings together the voices of 140 organizations who are taking action on climate. And that really couldn't be a stronger group of organisations, and for the church to be present there, adding our weight to that is really fantastic and crucial.
Thanks, James. We've got time for just one more question if you're very succinct on your answers, guys. I'm going to direct this at Andy Atkins. How diverse are the churches involved in these initiatives? Are there other church denominations involved? Especially, are there denominations with black majority churches involved?
Absolutely brilliant question. So you saw the set of logos that James put up. They are largely the traditional denominations and the Christian environment development missionary NGOs. One of the very objectives of Climate Sunday is precisely to reach out to those that have not yet been involved. And so that is, I mean, James referred to that. That is a major objective of the next 6 months. So we are putting out feelers, we have conversations going on, and we are looking at sending ambassadors out to those churches that haven't done this kind of stuff before to get them involved. That's one of the objectives of this. And if you look at that set of logos, you can see how important that objective is, because we've got the usual players around the table, which is fantastic, but we've got to now reach out to the rest.
Brilliant, thank you. Thank you to our panelists. We are now out of time for any more questions, so I'm just going to close. Thank you everyone involved for making this happen, and to our speakers, to the A Rocha staff, and of course to you guys who've given up your lunch to be with us. We hope that you've learned something new and that you feel really inspired to take action. We are just going to put a few links in the chat, but all these and more will be sent to you shortly in an email. This is a link to the Climate Sunday website, a link to sign up to Wild Christian if you'd like to receive our free monthly emails, and to be the first to hear about future Wild Christian webinars and other events. It's a free webinar, but if you would like to support the work of A Rocha UK, including our Wild Christian community, we suggest that you can make a donation of about £5 given the link given. And finally, we'd like to end our webinar with a short prayer taken from a resource on the Climate Sunday website. Oh God, you intended the world to be a place in which all play their part. In the health and wholeness of creation, we confess, sometimes in our attitudes and actions, that we have avoided our responsibilities or prevented others from fulfilling theirs. Give us by your Spirit and help us as we try to live differently in the days, weeks, and months ahead. God, in the life and words of your Son, his compassion and care for others, as he himself is dying, assure us of the generous depths of your forgiveness and of its restorative power. Help us now, through the energy of your Spirit, to love and live differently, that we and our world may become all that you intended. Amen. That's the end of our formal seminar time. Thank you so much for joining us. And again, all of these links will be sent to you after. Thank you very much.